Yeah. What level does this apply at? I'm mostly familiar with the state government system, although I also work in federal government, and that certainly follows the same thing. I would have to say in Australia, the federal government system is very much more dominated by the public service. They are very serious, and when things go to cabinet, it's like they've written 3 or 4 PhDs before it actually gets there. You don't have that same commitment to analysis that the state government ought to be doing, but they don't do enough of. They do, of course, some, and you can tell whether something has been dealt with seriously or not. But it's certainly, in terms of process and the lobby groups, the main way through the public service and the politicians' way through and the inner circle, all of those apply at federal level, state level, and I'd have to say at local level as well, just much smaller. Okay, so you're really talking about the political cycle and how this process works. You'd have to say that the closer and closer you get to an election, the less and less rational the process becomes and the more and more votes oriented it is. And therefore, we've just been through this whole boats situation, the refugees. We have tried in Australia all kinds of rational ways of doing it. You've got the best experts in the world who got together in a special advisory, and they adopted every element of their report. It still didn't work. So now we've got the dramatic political flourish solution with all kinds of implications, human rights implications, legal implications across the world in terms of our commitments to the UN and so on. These things get done at the last minute before an election as politicians get very nervous. I've seen very sensible people like Carmen Lawrence, PhD, who was a psychologist and really understood the problems of treating people in incarceration harshly as opposed to trying to rehabilitate them. She passed a law just before an election which was called the 3 Strikes Law, which threw kids into jail if they did 3 minor misdemeanors. And these were because 6PR ran a campaign and 30,000 people walked up St George's Terrace, and so she passed the law the next day because it was weeks out from an election. A really stupid thing to do. She regrets it, of course, and it was finally repealed because it was totally unworkable, but completely populist. Now, democracies tend to be like that, and fortunately they tend to work out over a period of time, but democracies take longer to make decisions, and they often get silly things done closer to elections. But I still think it is a better system than not having that, because dictators and kings and queens who are absolute monarchists with an absolute monarchy can do wonderful things quickly, but they can also do very, very seriously bad things quickly, and history is littered with both kinds. I've just been in Oman, where you have a totally benevolent dictator in charge. Everything he seems to have done has been extremely helpful, and he will be remembered forever in that country as the one who led them to a whole new level. But at the same time, when they got rid of King Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, he was replaced by Mengistu, who turned the place into a communist state, which he ruled with an iron hand, and he basically killed everybody who disagreed with him, just one after the other. And and it became a place of total fear. And when there was a famine, he wasn't able to cope with it, and 1.5 million people lost their lives in that famine. So both are there, and we need to have systems in place that can be checks and balances. Otherwise, human frailty can destroy us, and history's littered with that.
Basic question.
Yeah. Well, how does Parliament and Cabinet happen? It's all based on constitutions, the federal constitution, the state constitution. They set out how elections are to be done and when they're done and who votes. We now have full adult franchise, but we were one, and we were actually the second place in the world to give women the vote. South Australia was first, and it's become lower and lower, the age at which you can vote. So most people vote, and they are in electorates, and each of those electorates has one member of state parliament in the lower house, and they elect from a bigger region a series of upper house people. And in the Australian British system, we have the lower house who make most of the decisions, and the upper house reviews it. They can stop things, but they don't generally make rules, make laws. The process of change to get things to Parliament is through a cabinet. The cabinet is a group of 10 or 12 people who are appointed by the Premier. They could be appointed by the party that's won the election, but mostly it's the Premier or the Prime Minister who selects the people he wants to do particular things, and they have ministerial responsibilities for energy and water and environment and transport, and they have to work away at their portfolios, each with a set of laws that have been passed that govern what they can and can't do. But the key thing is that if they want to change anything that doesn't go outside their portfolios, then they can make that decision themselves. But if it impacts, like you want to build a new train, that's going to influence planning, it's going to influence energy, it's going to influence the affordable housing. All the other portfolios are going to be affected by it. So you have to take it to Cabinet. If it was entirely just a transport issue, you'd make the decision yourself as a minister. But if it's big and it requires a lot of money and affects other portfolios, you take it to Cabinet. So Cabinet talks about the things that cut across, and they generally are much more strategic, therefore. And the processes of Cabinet deciding on things are much more elaborate than what you would have within your own portfolio. So there is a distinction, and it's all based on the laws that have been passed as to what you can and can't do as a minister. What is the role of the opposition in this system? Oppositions are there to embarrass governments into doing the right thing, essentially, and they constantly review any laws that come up. That's the job of Parliament, to check what's been agreed to by Cabinet. It's been put into a bill, and you look at the fine print on it. Sometimes oppositions come up with very serious issues that weren't thought of, and so they adapt the bill. Now that's a good opposition, and it happens all the time. You never hear about it in the media, but in fact it's a bipartisan process to try and create a better law. And you may not like the thrust of the law, but you'll adapt it in some way because of X, Y and Z issues. And those processes of oppositions, they're divided up into particular areas. No one person can cope with all the laws that are coming through. So the opposition energy person reviews the bills coming through that are energy related. They also try to influence the other decisions that are happening that are not relating to law. They are just relating to what ministers are doing the whole time. And so that lower level, these things, policies not requiring cabinet approval, they're just announced, and the opposition are out there saying, what a stupid thing to do, because you didn't think of X, Y and Z. And the media run with that or don't. Or good ministers will check with the opposition before announcing it, but mostly they don't. And oppositions are often left bewildered by what's going on. But they are pretty much on the side. So oppositions don't like being oppositions. They want to get back in power, and they'll do anything to enable the right policies to be put forward at the right time for the election so that they can win and take over government and they can be in control of this process. That's the main game. Yeah, oppositions can control upper houses, and that the history of Australia is that coalition Conservative governments come and go in the lower house, but often have controlled the upper house through gerrymanders. Gerrymanders are the way in which the seats are set up so that you get more seats for Conservative areas like the countryside. And in the country, we've always had one person equivalent to 3 or 4 city people. It's getting more equitable all the time, but that has been the case. And they do make it very hard. So that's the other question that is often asked in Cabinet. Okay, this is the right thing to do, it makes sense economically, but we'll never get it through the upper house. And there were some things that really used to plague us on those kind of things when I was in government. And now you're in a position where the Greens tend to hold the balance of power, and in federal parliament that's the case. So there are ways in which you need to green things up if you want to get things through. And for me, that's fantastic, because every bill has to go, in the end, be agreed to by them. They can only modify it, but if it's got enough in it for them and they say yes, then we get a better bill out of it. So I think that the role of the Greens being in a minority, especially in the upper house, both state and federal, is very important. And they have played an extremely valuable role in greening bills that the various other processes would never have done. Yeah, how long does Parliament last, and can it be dissolved at will? You can only dissolve it if you're going to have an election. And if you get to the point where you just can't make decisions anymore, like that blocking in the upper house situation, if you get to the position where Cabinet are not actually able to work properly because you've had to bring various people from other parties into the Cabinet, that's often the way in India and now in the UK, it's a combined government between the Conservative Party and the Liberals, and they share Cabinet. Now, if that's not a workable relationship, then you dissolve and you have a new election to try and set it up. Italy has them every few weeks. It seems like that anyway. They're constantly dissolving and starting again and trying to get a new coalition together. The public service basically runs Italy, and the governments are playing around with all these things to try and have a stable system. And dissolving of Parliament is something that happens very rarely in the Australian system, because we mostly have one party in control at any one time. They don't have to make coalitions up. We've now got Nationals in with the Liberal Party in the state government. That happens at federal level as well, and they are fairly easy bedfellows. They get on pretty well.